Hi, this is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today I'm talking with Matt Lalonde, Ph.D. from Harvard University Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology. Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Okay, so first question I have for you is, how did you become interested or involved in thinking from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, I've always been interested in everything that had to do with diet and health. And I was a vegetarian for about 10 years of my life, actually vegan for 2 years and then vegetarian for 8 years. So for a decade, I didn't consume any meat at all. And I was writing my thesis in about 2008, and I decided that I would just apply the rigors of science to what I was eating, and to see whether or not the justifications I was giving for my way of life would actually hold up to scientific inquiry. And it failed miserably. Now, that is not to disrespect any vegetarian. I think that it is a completely legit way of life. There's just a good way to do it, and there's a bad way to do it. What's unfortunate is that a lot of the justifications that are used for it are incorrect. And then as I started looking for something else, something optimal, a bit more optimal, I fell onto CrossFit and then the Paleo Diet. And there's in CrossFit there's the Paleo Diet and the Zone Diet. And I actually was very skeptical of the Paleo Diet initially. So I tried Zone first, and then eventually fell into the Paleo Diet. The reason why I was skeptical of the Paleo Diet was the way in which it was justified, using exactly these evolutionary type arguments that make sense if you think about them, but then really fall apart if you really think about them. So, and that's how I got into it. I think that it's a very valuable way of thinking. It is a paradigm that it provides you with a way to ask questions and formulate hypotheses that is, I think, very precious. But you have to realize, and I say this especially to the non-scientific crowd, that no theory provides answers. Hypotheses are not answers, and you cannot go into the lab thinking that you already have the answer to the problem, because you are going to do biased research that's not going to be good at the end of the day, or not going to be as good.
Absolutely.
No, real scientist is trying to prove himself wrong, not prove himself right.
Yeah, absolutely. I teach introductory psychology, and I just gave that lecture, right? And they find that very hard to swallow, right?
It
Like, why,
is.
why would you be in a discipline where you're trying to prove yourself wrong? It just doesn't make intuitive sense. So you've been kind of for example, at the Ancestral Life Symposium in California last year. You were, as we were just talking, kind of the rogue presenter that was calling the paleo diet a little bit into question, and perhaps the science. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on perhaps what I would say, elaborate on what the paleoers would say is evidence, and maybe what you would like to see in terms of evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the talk was misinterpreted to some extent. My goal was really to help people better use or better justify the lifestyle, whether you're using the evolutionary approach or you're using the anti-nutrient approach. So I just sought to underline what I thought was incorrect, and then at the end of the talk give better answers to that. So from the evolutionary standpoint, you've probably heard of the same three arguments. Here are the arguments that I typically hear. So I'll hear someone say, well, our genes are virtually identical to those of our Paleolithic ancestors. So, we should be eating the same diet that they were eating. Now, that's correct. It also happens that our genes are virtually identical to those of a chimp.
Right.
What makes the difference between a human being and a chimp has more to do with epigenetics than it has to do, and that by that I mean gene expression, than it has to do with the genetic code itself. And what's interesting is that changes in gene expression lead to adaptation. And it would be pure folly to assume that we are epigenetically identical to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, given the changes in food and environment that have occurred since the Paleolithic era. So just because our genes are identical does not mean that we should have the same diet. That is not a legit argument. That takes care of that one. Then the second one, there's three of them. The second one, our ancestors and modern hunter-gatherers consumed a diet that was mostly devoid of grains, legumes, and dairy. And our ancestors and modern hunter-gatherers were virtually free of disease of civilization. So that must mean that if we consume the same diet, then we're also going to be free of the diseases of civilization. The problem with that argument is that it is an observation. You know, I see X and I see Y, but that does not tell you that X causes Y. There can be other variables that you are not observing that observe that effect. Those people, those modern hunter-gatherers, are in a completely different environment. They were subject to different types of stresses. Maybe they were outside more. They got more vitamin D. You know, there's just a ton of reasons why that could be the case. So that is, it's an invalid reference. It's actually a logical fallacy to assume that. So correlation does not equal causation, and an observation only gives you a correlation. So you cannot establish cause and effect based on that alone. So that's an invalid inference. Again, you know, the analogy that I like to use there is the ice cream analogy that you might have heard before. But, you know, every year as ice cream sales increase, deaths by drowning increase. So is it that people ate too much ice cream and then went in the pool and drowned? Did the ice cream sales really cause the drownings? Or if the other variable is that, well, the temperatures increase. So because it's warmer, people eat more ice cream, and because it's warmer, people go swimming more often, and hence there's more deaths by drowning.
Yeah.
And so you see that...
See, it's interesting when you make those kinds of logical, what appear to be very logical correlations that make no sense whatsoever. People are very apt to say, oh, right. But for some reason, and you know, to some extent, I've been subject to this as well. I mean, partly because the paleo way of eating kind of sits well with me personally. But when you say something like, eating like this is really good for you, and you know, Bob lost weight and so got cured of their autoimmune disorder, then it's true. So right. why do you think it is that I mean, do you think it's just that we're so fat? Like, who cares about people drowning and eating ice cream, but we're super conscientious about our waistline and what we put in our mouths?
Well, you know, at least when someone is offering anecdotal evidence, there's something personal there. You know, you feel a little bit closer to it, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. You probably know from a psychology standpoint, as opposed to some abstract observation or correlation.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that people feel like that's somehow more legitimate, but unfortunately, anecdotal evidence is the worst type of evidence that you can have. Right. You know, maybe even worse than a correlation. And there's no amount of n equals 1 that will amass to an actual scientific experiment that will count for data. They're all n equals 1. They're not clinical trials.
Right. Wow. So what's the third one that you go after?
So the third one that I like is, you know, we evolved over millions of years without consuming the foods that became readily available only after the advent of agriculture. So we're not adapted to them. So we shouldn't eat them. And, you know, first and foremost, we evolved over a million years. That's a royal we. That's like, yeah, okay, but, you know, we weren't human beings throughout that entire period of time. But then just because a species has never consumed a particular food doesn't mean it's not adapted to it. Doesn't mean that it won't tolerate it. And there are plenty of examples throughout evolution where a species finds a new source of food and thrives on it.
Yeah.
And you could argue that human beings are exactly that. You know, at some point our ancestors were hanging from the trees, eating mostly fruits. They came down to the savannah and started eating bone marrow from scavenged carcasses. And that allowed them to have smaller guts and bigger brains. And then they discovered cooking, which had an even bigger impact, or just as big an impact, and then eventually became some of the most feared hunters on the planet and extincted the megafauna.
Right.
But, you know, we did not used to eat meat, or very little of it. It doesn't mean that we weren't adapted to it. And there are other examples like that in the literature. So just because you've never eaten it doesn't mean you're not adapted to it. Maybe it means that you're less likely to be adapted to it, but I'm still uncomfortable with that statement, you know? So when I when I take a look at everything and I say, okay, if I want to use the evolutionary approach, what's the best way to phrase it such that there's no such conflict? I'm not falling into those traps. And that's the phrase that I offered, almost at the end of my talk, where I say, listen, there's been insufficient time and insufficient evolutionary pressure for complete adaptation to seed consumption to arise in Homo sapiens. And as a result, individuals that tolerate grains and legumes should be considered the minority and not the majority. So instead of saying we're not adapted to them, you're saying, well, listen, there's just hasn't been enough time for full adaptation to occur. So
Right.
you're acknowledging the fact that some people tolerate this better than others, and maybe even motivating some people to think, hey, where do I stand on that spectrum? And I wonder, maybe I'll run the experiment just to see what I can tolerate and what I can't tolerate. And keep in mind, there's a lot. When I say seeds, I mean grains, legumes, edible seeds like sunflower seeds, and nuts. So there's a lot of stuff there that you might not tolerate. So you might consider the paleo diet a blunt tool in that it eliminates all of those. But then realistically, if you start looking at, say, the fact that grain agriculture isn't sustainable, the fact that grains are poorly nutritious relative to vegetables and even meat, there isn't that much of a good reason to justify the consumption of grains, really.
Right.
The legumes are probably a little bit better because they enrich the soil, and then a lot of the anti-nutrients are destroyed when you cook them. So, they still have problematic proteins, and then we get into the whole anti-nutrient thing. I'm not sure if you want to get into that now or later, but I boil that down to like a phrase, essentially.
Really? What's the phrase?
The proteins are the problem.
Yeah. Okay. And from what I understand, processing a lot of these things that would otherwise, when eaten raw, for example, or eaten in an unprocessed state, cause lots of problems. The cooking process or the processing, perhaps even something like chewing, can eliminate some of those problems.
Yeah. So one thing I would look into is the research by Richard Wrangham and Rachel Carmody that recently came out, right, of Harvard, so I'm a little bit biased there. Rachel Carmody might actually present at the AHS 2012. We're trying to get her to present.
Cool.
So yeah, I'm really hoping that she does. So the cooking process will increase the digestibility of the food, and that's because, for one, it will neutralize certain anti-nutrients. For example, wheat germ agglutinin, phytohemagglutinin, those are lectins, and specifically wheat and legumes that are very toxic. There's no doubt lectins are toxic. They are really problematic. The thing is that they get destroyed by heat. So there's very few that survive the processing process. I consider heating a process.
Yeah, sure.
Cooking, I consider that processing. There are very few of them that will survive that. The nuts actually do survive, so even peanuts, which is a legume. So certain nuts and peanuts, the lectins will survive the heating process. That increases the digestibility of the food too, because it changes the chemical nature. So you're both eliminating some of the anti-nutrients and in some cases completely destroying certain anti-nutrients, as well as increasing the digestibility. So the cooking is really good. Fermentation, also really good, because cooking doesn't have a huge effect on phytate, but if you ferment, then you essentially destroy the phytate. You remove the phosphorus groups around the myoinositol, and then that releases some of the nutrients some of the minerals that they're chelating, so you get more of the minerals from your food. That being said, the fact that minerals in plants are chelated by phytates doesn't mean that if you eat the plant, it's going to steal minerals from you. That would only happen if you were eating free phytic acid.
Okay.
But it does mean that the minerals that are in plants are a lot less bioavailable than the ones in meat, meaning that if you eat it, the minerals in meat will be better absorbed, or to a greater percentage than those in plants.
Okay. So let me ask you a broader question. I mean, Lauren Cordain has made an absolutely outstanding career and probably a large bank account on the paleo diet. And the paleo diet essentially is founded in the biological theory. It's called mismatch theory, right? The idea that, we're carrying around a bunch of old stuff. And, what's your answer to that? And to the scientist and the layperson, right? I mean, what do you say to somebody who says, well, we're just cavemen, right?
My answer would be very similar to what I've already said. It's not about the genes. It's not about the genetic code. It's the epigenetics. We just haven't had enough time to adapt to eating these foods, and it's specifically the protein digestion. The plant proteins are difficult to digest, and for a good reason. Plants can be attacked by a variety of things on a daily basis, and they can't move. So they have to protect themselves by synthesizing tough proteins, certain anti-nutrients to attack anything that's trying to eat them, so on and so forth. The proteins are very rich in proline. It's a unique amino acid, and then it's secondary. It will be a little bit harder to hydrolyze the peptide bonds to proline as a result. It has a secondary nitrogen atom. So it's going to be a little bit harder to hydrolyze the bonds to proline. And or I should say it has a tertiary carbon right next to the amino acid group. It just makes the peptide bonds harder to hydrolyze, and the undigested peptides turn out to have biological activity, a variety of different biological activities. Some of them are cytotoxic, some of them are immunoactive, some of them are active in the brain, all kinds of really nasty things that can happen. And that appears to be one of the main problems with those things. One of the peptides specifically, when it comes to gluten, actually causes the secretion of a molecule, zonulin, that then forces the tight junctions between the enterocytes to open up. And then that gives access to the immune system now gets access to various bacteria that are in the gut, various undigested food proteins, all kinds of stuff that goes straight through the gut to the immune system, and it causes inflammation. That inflammation can then reach the brain. It can trigger autoimmune reactions, which can damage various parts of the body, so on and so forth. But it's more, the mismatch it's easy. It's easy to say that, but it's not just a genetic mismatch. It's an epigenetic mismatch.
Okay.
And you should not make these broad, overarching statements of everyone is completely intolerant to this and no one should be eating it. However, I think that when you consider the totality of the evidence, like I said, the grains are also rich in omega-6, the agriculture is not sustainable, they're not very nutritious, then you can say there's no good reason I can find to eating that.
Right.
But really shouldn't say, no one should be eating this stuff and no one's adapted to it. Because there's obviously people who eat that stuff, they remain slender. I'm not convinced that they remain absolutely free of disease, but they manage to live for a long time without suffering any of the consequences. And that's the problem. Like you're never going to see full adaptation to this stuff because one, it's not killing us before we can reproduce.
Absolutely what I was just going to say.
Yeah. And two, the pressure's not high enough.
Right.
If you put someone on a field of wheat and all they get to eat is unprocessed whole wheat, meaning that they can just crush it and eat it, then you're going to force some adaptations pretty early on. If you look at when the Egyptians were adopting this way of life, eating whole grain as a majority of their calories, infant deaths were very high. And that's because, a child that was born with either celiac disease or someone had type 1 diabetes or whatnot, they died. There's nothing to do. So to some level, there has been some selection. There's been some adaptation. And that's not often acknowledged. I think they just don't like to acknowledge it. I'm like, listen, it's real, it's there, and by not acknowledging it, you're just losing credibility.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and the fact that it's not impeding reproduction, which is, tantamount to adaptation. Adaptation is only, I always tell my evolutionary biology students that adaptation is only as good as it gets you into the next generation. That's right. And so, that being said, I could live on a diet of potatoes and spaghetti for the rest of my life, and chances are I'd have more kids, right? Yep. So adaptation to selection pressure is slow. It's probably due to this processing. So I have two more questions for you, and they're just real short. The first question is, if this was your field, this is your discipline, and you were going to go out and design a study, and I don't want you to let any cats out of the bag if you got something under works or whatever, but if you were going to design the perfect study, what would it look like?
The perfect study to determine...
To try and determine what the optimal diet is.
Oh, wow.
Would it be more of a nutrigenetics approach where we look at individuals and their origin of descent and sensitivity to certain things?
It depends on the approach that you want to take. Like if you want to find a baseline, I think that the paleo diet's a pretty good baseline.
Okay.
But then within that, the thing that starts to vary is the macronutrient ratios. For example, there's a lot of people that will say, well, hey, the Inuit can live on a diet that's all meat and fat, so I can do that too. And they try to reproduce it with, say, steak. And the diet is different in so many ways. For one, the population was probably adapted to that diet for a while.
Right.
And then two, they're eating fish that's rich in omega-3 and also has iodine in it. So if you do that with, market bought steak that's rich in omega-6 and poor in omega-3, doesn't have any iodine in it, this experiment's not going to end well for you.
Right.
So trying to find that baseline maybe would be interesting, but my guess is it would be a start, and then for some people moving in a certain direction, like adding more carbohydrate or less carbohydrate, or playing with the macronutrients is going to give you better or worse results. As far as you're trying to figure out, well, let's say you wanted to genetically come up with tests that would allow you to figure out whether or not the person can tolerate oats, or whether or not they can tolerate quinoa or whatnot. I just don't think there's a lot of use for that.
Right.
Again, when you look at the fact that this stuff is not really sustainable from an agriculture standpoint, I'm like, okay, but why? Why would you want to eat that?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can currently grow it cheaply? Yeah, but it's not going to last for long. I mean, some of the most pessimistic scientists say we've got about 50 years of topsoil left if we keep up weaned corn agriculture at its current state.
It's terrible.
Which is not good news.
No.
What's interesting is if you look in the scientific literature, guess what's used to fix the land once it's been ruined by corn or wheat agriculture?
What's that?
Cattle's grazing on grass. Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Imagine that, the cows that eat grass. Right? I mean, It's like an anomaly nowadays, right?
That's right.
That's outstanding. All right, my last question, right? So the community that we're trying to reach is this sort of...
Actually, let me say this with regards to the question you just asked.
Okay.
If you were to design the diet, let's say you wanted to test the Paleo Diet, you would have to be really careful because, and I told this to Gary Taubes, if you go to a Gary Taubes talk, he'll say, he wants to see this 1.5 million study run where both groups are on hypercaloric diets, and one group's on a high carb diet and the other group's on a low carb diet. He thinks that would answer the question for all. But then I looked at his low carb diet, and he specifically said the low carb people would be eating meat and vegetables. I said, hey, Gary, that's a low carb paleo diet.
That's right.
So if that works, how do you know if it's the carbs or if it's the grains and legumes? And the answer is you don't.
Yep.
Right? You don't. So if you're testing this, you're going to have to, test high carb and low carb both, and then paleo and non-paleo both.
Right.
Just to really have, an answer of
a proper randomized controlled trial where you have legumes, grains, everything included, excluded. God, the number of conditions would be a lot of money.
There's a recent study that just came out by Richard Johnson. He's a big fructose researcher. And he showed that a moderate fructose diet was healthier than a low fructose diet. And if you look up the fructose metabolism and everything inside there on fructose, that makes no sense, right? So people are looking at the paper, and I'm like, well, it's hypocaloric. So when you're hypocaloric, you have fewer chances of causing problems. But then I look at the low fructose diet, and they replaced all the fructose with starch from grains and cereals.
Yeah.
So the low fructose group is eating 3 times more grains and cereals than the moderate fructose group, and they find that moderate fructose is better. And anyone who knows anything about the grains are like, yeah, wow, that's flawed. I'm sorry, but that's fail on you.
Yeah, or I mean, really, it's interesting. It's just the wrong title, right?
Yeah.
The paper's just titled wrong.
Yeah, but you still need more.
More
information to make sure that's what's actually going on.
Wow, that's outstanding. I have to get a copy of that paper. Last question. So we got this audience of sort of scientists, lay people who are interested in evolution and the application of evolution. And of course, we've got the ancestral lifestyle people who are, I guess some of them are trying to live the caveman lifestyle, barefoot and all that, and MoveNat type stuff. And then we got the other people that, still wear shoes and all that, but really like to optimize their diet. So if you had to tell, say, a bunch of active individuals what to eat, what would you tell them to eat?
Just meat, vegetables, and tubers.
That's it. Meat,
Yeah.
vegetables, and tubers. No dairy, legumes, or grains.
Yeah, no. For as a baseline, I would say no. You can
Awesome.
play with dairy. That tends to be the gray area. The problem with dairy is the sugar and the fat and the
Okay.
protein. Sorry. So the casein is very much like the prolamine proteins of the grains. It's very rich in proline, especially the kappa casein, I think, or gamma. And then the lactose is not tolerated well by certain people.
Okay.
But yeah, I've called it the meat and vegetable diet, or even the seedless diet. I've joked around and told people maybe I'll write a book called the Seedless Diet or something like that. But I'm not interested in writing another diet book.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's just meat and vegetables and tubers. I know it's not sexy, but that's what it is.
That's what it does.
And
Awesome.
figure out within there, where do you need more protein, less protein, more carbohydrate, less carbohydrate. Like I don't care whether you're omnivorous, carnivorous, vegetarian, high carb, low carb. Just eat meat, vegetables, and tubers.
Nice. Awesome. Easy as pie, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if you're a vegetarian, eat more fat from avocados and coconut, and you eat plenty of tubers. I mean, there are populations that have been shown to survive on up to 95% of their calories from either potatoes or sweet potatoes. So
How about that?
go ahead. Like I said again, I think it's really unwise to take this very morally committed population and ridicule them because they're not eating meat. That's just, I think we can bring them on board very easily and have them be just as healthy while they can accomplish all of their goals.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that appreciation of other approaches. What I get from sort of colleagues and sometimes I get pitched as the person who's like the paleo preacher, and I try to be like open minded about it. But you get this idea that you hate every other diet or people that you're judging people when they're eating something different. But it sounds like from your perspective, there's very open minded. Different types of diets can be included in this as long as you sort of stick to those basics.
Absolutely. But then, you also have to tell people, hey, what works best for you? Like, okay, let's say you want to be a vegetarian, but you try the diet and you feel rotten.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe you're just not well adapted to that.
Yeah.
There are some populations, if you try to look at whether or not there are vegetarian populations that pass, not quite. They still had about 5% animal protein in there. Doesn't mean it can't be done or shouldn't be done. But again, there's probably some level of adaptation there on part of that population. So if you feel really rotten, then hey, just do something else or try to tweak it or
Yeah.
make some changes.
Use some common sense.
That's right.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you very much for your time. Once the link is sort of solidified, it goes up on the magazine, I'll shoot you an email with the link.
Excellent.
And I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank
All
you.
right.
It's fun.
Have a good one.
You too.